Brought to you by Prep Matters and the Self-Driven Child.
We're not talking about, oh, we must be teetotalers for our entire life and there's no drugs or alcohol ever. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about delay, because it's important not just for the brain, but for the chances that your kid will have a problem later. 90% of people who have drug and alcohol issues later on in life say they started using before 18. Again, correlation causation issues. And then we also know that with each passing year, the risk of having substance use disorder during your lifetime goes down dramatically, actually. So if you look at like 8th grade versus 12th grade, you cut your risk way, way down with each passing year. So if we can just delay, that age of first use, then we are just doing a huge amount, not only for their brain development, but to lower the risk that they'll have a problem later in life.
How important are standardized tests?
Why isn't my child doing well in school?
Do you need a high school diploma to apply to Harvard?
Education is one of our most cherished institutions, but it can also be one of our most exasperating. And it's where almost all of our children go, from toddlers learning their ABCs to critically thinking adults stepping out into the world. I talk with experts in helping teens and tweens navigate the transition to adulthood in order to bring you the tools you need to help grow resilient, self-driven, and successful young adults. I'm Ned Johnson, and this is PrepTalks. Jessica Lahey, The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. Jessica Lahey is a teacher, writer, and mom. Over 20 years, she's taught every grade from 6th to 12th in both public and private schools. She writes about education, parenting, and child welfare for The Atlantic, Vermont Public Radio, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Jessica is also the author of the best-selling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed, published in 2015, and she co-hosts the podcast, #AmWriting. She earned a BA in Comparative Literature from the University of Massachusetts and a JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law. Jessica lives in Vermont with her husband and 2 sons. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me again.
I am so looking forward to this conversation, and I so appreciated this book. For folks who know and love and have followed your work for years, I have the sense that this book may be a little bit of a surprise because they know you as being so capable and so competent. And you described yourself in this book as, self-described overachieving perfectionist.
Yeah. So the last 5 years of my teaching career, I was working in a drug and alcohol rehab for adolescents. I was their teacher, their writing teacher, but really I taught a little of everything. And I always, we had a sort of a constantly changing cast of characters in our classroom because kids stay for all different periods of time and they're coming and going all the time. So I have to reintroduce myself each class. And every time I'd introduce myself, I would always introduce myself by telling them that I'm an alcoholic and I have my sober date is June 7th, 2013. And
I imagine that was really purposeful because I have the sense it also helps people broaden their sense of what an alcoholic might look like.
Yeah, they always say, almost always, they're like, you don't look like an alcoholic. And I think that's just because we have a fairly limited imagination, and that's what the media shows us something different. But as Stephen King says in On Writing, we all look about the same when we're puking in the gutter. So, Stephen King was an alcoholic and a drug addict, and I'm an alcoholic. And I think, we come in lots of shapes and sizes, and we definitely come in lots of backgrounds. But having gone to 12-step recovery program meetings for a long time, there are a lot of people that look like me and a lot of people with a similar story to me, lots of perfectionists, lots of people with anxiety, which is one of the main reasons I think I started drinking. It's not an uncommon story. I'm not, I think it's going to be really important as we start learning about preventing substance abuse that we figure out that there aren't a lot of ways to predict based on demographics or socioeconomics, that kind of thing, who's going to have a problem and who's not.
Well, one of the points in the book that you raise is how important and how valuable it is to normalize conversations about substance use and substance abuse disorder. I wonder if you could take a moment and just to frame things for us. How is substance use disorder defined, and how do people come to know that they have that? I'm thinking about you taking your test, and I'm thinking, but I'm grading on a curve here.
And I'm also glad you're using the word substance use disorder. I think, despite the fact that the word addiction is in the title of my book, it should be probably out there from the beginning that everyone from all the style guides changed in the last couple of years. We're not supposed to say someone who we're not supposed to talk about addicts. We're not supposed to talk about junkies. We're supposed to use person first language. Like, just as you wouldn't say he is an autistic, you would say he is a person with autism. I am a woman with a substance use disorder. However, you try writing the title of a book that uses the term substance use disorder. It's tough.
Roll off the tongue, not so much.
I know. So I'm really happy that you're with me on the language stuff. And that language, I think, is important, mainly because, what the attempt is to take the stigma off of, that person-oriented language, so that we can sort of understand that this is something that, around 10% of us have an issue with because of our wiring, because of our brain chemistry, whatever that thing is. And so, from that perspective, I think it's important to talk about the fact that, it is a scary conversation to have with kids, but it doesn't start with a conversation about, like injecting heroin. It starts really, really young. And the big spoiler alert here is that really good substance abuse prevention programs in schools and with parents look a lot like, no coincidence, really good social emotional learning programs and really good health programs. And really good health programs don't start with a conversation about injecting heroin. They start with a conversation about brushing our teeth and why we don't swallow the toothpaste, why we spit it out, and why we wash our hands, and why, and conversations about, like, when kids are first learning their letters and talking about whose name is written on that label for that medication. And why do you think mommy's name is on that label and not daddy's name? Or why can you take something that's prescribed for mommy and why not? I think those are the conversations we start with. And that makes it a lot less scary because we're sort of, doing developmentally appropriate things and stuff like that. And then, just as the sex conversation is not one conversation, the substance abuse conversation is not one conversation either, because, sorry, the dog is deciding to chew on my Jane Austen figurine.
Well, we know the dogs are one of the solutions that you have in the back of the book. So totally welcome to the party.
And so I think, having conversations, it gets easier and easier. And I can tell you right now that the first time I had to talk to my kids about my substance use, I got sick and threw up. It was so scary to me. And so, but every single time you have those conversations, it gets easier and easier, just like, as we normalize conversations about sex and consent and stuff like that. Go off and read Peggy Orenstein's book, Girl and Sex and Boys and Sex. Read those for that. But it's a similar sort of situation. I promise, the more you talk about it, the easier it gets.
Brene Brown and the Me Too. And, it's interesting, Jess, so many of the points that you make in the book just strike me, as just good parenting, just good parenting across the board. So there's advice there that will help all parents, really with all kids, whether or not substance abuse ever, darkens your door, which I thought was so great. And I also really appreciated how progressive it is. I mean, the age appropriate conversations, your point about toothpaste and brushing your teeth that you can have with little guys, and kind of what this sequence might look, year after year, mile after milestone, which is just so good. There are pages and pages and pages about really wonderful insights about different drugs and what they do to brains. And so I won't drag us through all that, because we could talk for hours about it. But in a big picture way, could you talk a little bit about what we should know about substance and substance abuse and developing brains in just kind of a high level way?
There are some really interesting conversations going on right now about drug use in adults. Dr. Carl Hart has a new book called, he has one book called High Price, but he has a new one called Drug Use for Grownups. Michael Pollan has written beautifully about psychedelics. And I think those conversations have been really interesting to me lately, because a lot of people want to talk about the fact that, they like those books that are talking about adult use, like to talk about the fact that risk is overblown and, you can responsibly use drugs and alcohol. And I think that's absolutely correct. There is some really cool stuff going on with psychedelics and end of life and PTSD and stuff like that. And Carl Hart makes some really good arguments in his book about, safe drug use for adults. What I want to make it clear is that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about children and adolescents. Adolescents are going through the second of two of the most, where their brains are what we call the most plastic. Plastic meaning that, yes, they're changing and evolving, but they're also acutely sensitive to the environment for good and for bad. So the good stuff we do for them, the good things we give them, the supports we give them, that will positively impact their brains. All the sleep and the good nutrition and all that sort of stuff will have a great positive impact on the brain. And the stuff that they put in their bodies or that affects them, adverse childhood experiences, stuff like that, will negatively affect them in a way that it might not later on as adults, or even as children who are older than 2 and haven't yet hit puberty. So much change is going on in the brain. The neurons are getting covered with the myelin, and the synapses are just going crazy. Synaptogenesis, we're getting like new synapses all the time. The frontal lobe is going online. Now, it's not just that construction is happening, although that's really, really important. Things are... In the adolescent brain, the big struggle is to keep some sort of equilibrium, right? And we have Dr. Lauren Steinberg writes beautifully about sort of the 2 different phases of growth in the brain, and the fact that during adolescence, this sort of lower brain emotion, limbic system stuff is in overdrive, and the organized higher level stuff that they're getting that they're hooking up to in their frontal lobe isn't quite hooked up yet, but that's coming. And so they have drives toward novelty and risk and doing things that are dangerous that their frontal lobe isn't quite ready to be fully in charge of. The conductor is not quite on duty yet. I sometimes refer to it as like the bus driver and all the loud kids in the back of the bus. All the loud kids in the back of the bus punching each other, that's the lower brain sort of limbic system, and the bus driver who can keep track of all those kids and, stoplights, that's the frontal lobe. That bus driver is just not quite fully there yet. And some of the stuff that drugs and alcohol do to the brain, either because the receptors for that particular drug, like for example, marijuana, the parts of the brain that sort of the marijuana chemicals latch onto are in the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is so important for learning and memory and processing emotional memories. And when we mess with that stuff during adolescence, not only does development sort of get off track, there's no backsies on this either. Like once they hit their mid-20s, that period of plasticity is pretty much over. And it's not like you can go back and get makeups on, the stuff that you missed because you were doing drugs when you were 16 and you affected how your hippocampus works. There's all kinds of questions about correlation and causation, but the hippocampus is smaller in kids who are chronic users of marijuana, for example. Whereas in adults, I'm not going to say that there's no bad effects for marijuana in the adult brain, but there are a lot fewer negative effects in the adult brain than if a kid whose brain is still developing, starts using drugs like that. And there are lots of other little things, and I try not to bore people with them in the book. I tried to make it as, digestible as possible for someone who isn't as big of a dork as me and doesn't want to know all the tiny little details. But yeah, it does a lot more damage in an adolescent brain, some of it permanent, some of it temporary, some of it permanent. And it's important to know that, because we're not talking about, oh, we must be teetotalers for our entire life and there's no drugs or alcohol ever for our entire lives. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about delay, because it's important not just for the brain, but for the chances that your kid will have a problem later. 90% of people who have drug and alcohol issues later on in life say they started using before 18. Again, correlation causation issues. And then we also know that with each passing year, the risk of having substance use disorder during your lifetime goes down dramatically, actually. So if you look at like 8th grade versus 12th grade, you cut your risk way, way down with each passing year. So if we can just delay, that age of first use, then we are just doing a huge amount, not only for their brain development, but to lower the risk that they'll have a problem later in life.
I'd love to talk about two things. One, sort of the feedback loop of struggle and academic struggle, and you talk about so well. But before we do, I'd love to, if you can just give us an overlay. You talk about genetics and epigenetics, which a lot of people might have explained to them. And you alluded to A scores, which I think are worth talking about. All in the sense that the phrase that always pops to my mind when I think about these things is that as a society, particularly a vaguely puritanical one, we want to ascribe character to all of these issues when ultimately a lot of it is chemical. And you talk so much about shame that we heap scorn and shame on other people, but we also heap it on ourselves. And for us to understand that there are genetic and epigenetic and vulnerabilities, and also the ones that we grow up with, that we're not responsible for, but we can do something about. So could you just talk about kind of how much of what causes, puts us in this position?
So before we even start, let's talk about risk and protection from substance abuse, like an old-timey scales of justice scale, right? So the heavier your risk side, the heavier your protection side is going to need to be. So starting with genetics. Genetics are not destiny. I happen to have lots of relatives with drug and alcohol problems. I grew up in a household where one of my parents is the recovering alcoholic now. And that's great. I'm so happy. My sister doesn't have a problem. My husband grew up in a family where he has drug abusers and alcoholics in his family, but he is a everyday, normal, moderate user, and he managed to escape that. So genetics, it looks like, is about 50 to 60% of the picture. And I hate this analogy. It is incredibly apt, so I'm going to use it, but I'm not a fan. I got to come up with something better. Picture genetics as the bullet that you put in a gun, and trauma is the trigger. So lots and lots of people can have that genetics bullet loaded, but it's the trauma that pulls the trigger. And that's where things bleed over into this thing called epigenetics, which just means above the genes. Essentially what it means is that I could have the genetics for something, but the environment that I grow up in and the stresses that I encounter, especially toxic stress, can really cause my genes to express in different ways. So I'm not actually changing my genetics, but I'm changing the way the genes work, essentially. And that epigenetics is a huge field that's just exploding right now. And it's fascinating. It's so interesting. So epigenetics and genetics, that's like 60% of the picture, 50 to 60% of the picture is genetics. And then we get to the trauma, the ACEs that you talked about. And what ACEs means is adverse childhood experiences. The CDC and Kaiser Permanente did this massive study looking at things that happened to people in their childhood and what kind of health outcomes they had later. And it turns out that adverse childhood experiences affect so many things, from our mental health to whether or not we have a stroke at a young age, to whether or not we have a heart attack later on, all kinds of stuff, including substance abuse. And if you want a better picture of that, you don't have to read the CDC's and Kaiser Permanente stuff. You could go read Nadine Burke-Harris's beautiful book, The Deepest Well, as she talks about how ACEs affect her patients. She is a pediatrician, and what she sees as, and she adds on to the CDC's list. CDC has, in fact, if you want to find out your own ACE score, Google ACE quiz and CDC, and you'll get a quiz, and you'll get your score 1 out of 10. And at any given time in my rehab classroom, most of the kids scored somewhere between like a 6 and a 10. So those kids had lots of adverse childhood experiences, which include things like violence in the home, substance abuse in the home, loss of a parent, separation, divorce, those kinds of things. Now, I always get nervous mentioning separation and divorce because 50% of marriages end in divorce. So the last thing I want to do is make parents feel like, oh, great, now I've really screwed up. I did the best I could do getting out of that marriage. It was really toxic for everyone. What I'm talking about when I talk about risks is not things you should feel bad for. what I'm talking about when I talk about risks are things that are, it's information that is powerful, right? Because some of the other risk factors are things like academic failure and generally, but especially early academic failure, social ostracism, early aggression. If your child is aggressive towards other kids, that is a big warning sign that your kid may be at risk for substance abuse later on in life. But you can also imagine how these things get all tangled up, right? So like if a kid is aggressive, then they may also be socially ostracized, and social ostracism and academic failure are also intertwined. So early intervention for these things is super important. And I don't want parents to feel like I'm not doing enough. Oh my gosh, one more thing I have to do. All I'm saying is, like, when I look at my own kids, I say, well, great. I've not only given them the genetics, but I've screwed up on a whole bunch of other fronts as well, trying to do the best we can do for our family, like moving during a really delicate transition time.
Mm-hmm.
And transitions are another big risky time for kids. But I'm not feeling bad about that. What I'm saying is, I now have power. I have some control based on the fact that I know these risk factors exist. So now that I know that, what can I do on the protection side to outweigh that? So I think I want to empower parents. I don't want parents to feel shame. I don't want them to feel bad. I don't want them to feel like there's all these other things they have to do. I want parents to feel empowered with this knowledge. And that's my goal with this.
Well, I think you do a great job of that in part. Pointing out a lot of these things that are stressors, not just independent stressors, but, sort of, chicken and egg and, compounding effects that a lot of things, that parents might not necessarily think about. That aggression cannot, and tempers are oftentimes nothing more than a sensitive stress response. That is the fight, the freeze, fight, or frighten. Because you talked about anxiety early on. We so often think that, we have a certain model of what anxious kids look like. And it doesn't occur to a lot of people that, particularly little boys who get into, tangles more readily, that they just may be much more sensitive to the world than that they live in.
That's why I love it when I go and tour schools and I was in a school in Dallas, and I went into the kindergarten, and in all of the elementary school classrooms, they had, pictures of brains and explanation of the lower brain and the higher brain functions. And teachers would talk to the kids in terms of, and kids understood, like, the reason I want to punch her for saying something mean to me is because I'm acting from my lower brain. And if I want to be a big kid, I have to try to think about it before I do it. And I do that with my upper brain. That kind of language is empowering to kids. And so the earlier we start talking about brain development with kids in obviously developmentally appropriate language, the better we can help kids understand that they can be in control, and they can have, it also helps with integration of their brain functions. Dan Siegel's work in the book Aware in particular, he talks a lot about, helping kids get more integrated. And one of the things that he also talks about Dan Siegel talks about in terms of drug and alcohol abuse is that a lot of people who have issues with drug and alcohol abuse are just have a lack of integration in their brain functions. Their lower brain and their upper brain are just not, working together. And so that's one of the reasons I decided to try some of his guided meditation stuff in the book with my kid, just to see, what, if that would help at all. But yeah, I think that's one of the things we can do for kids. And as Dan Siegel's writing partner, Tina Payne Bryson, talks about also, you got to name it to tame it. And kids need to be able to name their emotions and name what is frustrating them and how they feel about stuff. I don't know if you've seen it lately, but on like TikTok and YouTube, there have been these kindergarten teachers that come on and talk about politicians who are behaving badly and how a kindergarten teacher would address it. Like,
really,
sweetie, I know. And there was actually one about Piers Morgan that I saw this morning. Okay, sweetie, I know you're angry. I know it makes you very angry when people say, validate the emotion and help them name it. But sweetie, you just can't storm off the set and quit your job because someone had an argument against something you said that was mean to Meghan Markle. It was very funny.
Oh, so, I love it.
Yeah.
And pulling together both Dan Siegel's talk about mindfulness meditation, and also Tina Payne Bryson with the name entertainment, that both of those get at the really great point that you make about that it creates some distance from the feeling, some distance from the situation, so that we don't respond as intensely, right? That we can look at these things from some distance and have conversations. And so much of the book is so helpful in helping parents, all of us, to, how to have conversation with kids about that.
Yeah, the mindfulness thing I was talking about, the Dan Siegel one, his Wheel of Awareness sort of guided. You can just Google Wheel of Awareness Dan Siegel, and it's right there on his website. But it's interesting because it takes you in various steps. It takes you sort of out of yourself a little and helps you distance yourself from those scary big emotions, in not ignore them, but help you get outside of them, to look back at them. In two of his books, actually, Mindsight and Aware, he talks about an adolescent that he was treating, and that adolescent had a lot of problems, had behavior conduct disorders, because he had a lot of trouble, maybe it was anxiety, but he had a lot of trouble getting outside those big feelings and being able to look at them from outside. And that's, the work that he did with this kid was essentially integrating that. But the kid in that book actually would be a prime candidate for substance use disorder, because when those feelings are so big and so scary, especially for kids that have had violence in their lives and abuse in their lives, it's not every kid that gets, let me help you practice this mindfulness stuff. And instead it's like, oh man, I just want to stuff that down. I want to numb out. I want to take an opiate and not feel it anymore. And that works great in the short term. And in fact, there are some people that say, and this is controversial, but a lot of people have been through super heavy duty, like 10 out of 10, sort of trauma stuff. I knew this one woman who had been just through horrific violence in her childhood. And she said that drugs are what kept her alive and able to cope until she could get to a point where she could get help for herself. And while I certainly don't advocate for that solution, it was a really interesting way of putting it, that no one else was helping her with her all these big feelings she was having and her trauma and all that other stuff. So she had to deal with it the way she could. And she ended up having to use drugs, and it almost killed her. But on the other hand, she got sober as an adult. And she says, looking back, I don't know that I would have stayed alive if I hadn't been able to numb that feeling out somewhere. So for me, the big idea is, how do we help kids from the beginning so that they don't get to the point where they need to numb out, have a beer so that they get that liquid courage, so they can feel enough, so they can, the drink I miss the most always is the one before going to the party, so that I don't feel like an imposter walking in. So I don't feel as socially awkward walking into a party. And now I have to just say, well, what the heck's your problem that you get nervous walking into a party of people that are your friends? Helping kids sort of get at the root cause rather than having to mask it by having a beer and getting some liquid courage should be our goal, I think, at all times.
Yeah, that discussion of one drink, Jess, was pretty
One drink Jess is great. One drink Jess is fantastic. The problem is I can't have just one drink. I mean, and that's the other thing I want parents to understand is that, for 90% of y'all out there, God bless you, you can have the drinks and the drugs that you want if they're not hurting anyone else, because if you don't have a problem with it, then, this book is still for you. And I'm not, 90% of kids, lots of kids are going to try drugs and alcohol and never have a problem with it. Right. And there's, if you look at the studies for even the Vietnam study, a whole bunch of Vietnam veterans were exposed to heroin when they were in Vietnam. And so they took a lot of heroin when they were in Vietnam, and they came home, and a whole bunch of them, a remarkable percentage of them, got better and never went back, never relapsed without doing any treatment at all. It was a situational, thing for them. A lot of kids are going to be able to try a lot of stuff and be fine. What I'm trying to do is help prevent substance use for two reasons. One, because it harms the brain, and it makes it so that they don't have to deal with the stuff that they should be dealing with at the time. And two, to prevent the 10% of them later on who might have issues with substance use disorder. I mean, I would like to work from both of those perspectives.
Well, and I love that second point is a really interesting one because you may mention a while ago that there's all this plasticity in the brain during adolescence. And if you miss that opportunity, if you garble the whole thing up, you can't kind of do at 24, what you're supposed to do at age 14 or 15. But
there's also a thing where when kids start really abusing drugs and alcohol, there's sort of an arrested development thing that happens. And it's, a lot of people talk about the fact that when you go into recovery, you're really picking up where you left off when you got, when you really started using heavily because you didn't learn coping skills and mature in the way that you should have. So it's not just from a chemical and wiring perspective, but also from an emotional perspective. It sort of arrests you where you were.
Well, I think that's very well said. And certainly from your book, The Gift of Failure, of talking about how important the experiences are for kids to struggle with things with support, of parents and teachers, but to struggle with hard things because that's how they grow and develop, both as people and neurologically. And if you, I had the student years ago who was a lovely kid, but we're, doing dreary test prep through junior year. And he wasn't motivated for anything, and certainly not engaging with SAT prep. And I was kind of like, man, I don't get this. And I kind of said it casually, something to one of his friends, which maybe I shouldn't have. And he's like, oh, him, Mr. Wake and Bake. And I thought, and I had no idea because I'm so square. I didn't know what I was seeing. And I thought, these are, because you talk about this with THC, not only that it impairs our ability to recall things, but we literally don't create memories because this group, what the hippocampus does, and you think you just wash out 4 years of that really important work of developing who you are and who the brain you're going to have as an adult.
Yeah, that's also what alcoholic blackouts are, what makes them so scary. And what made them so scary for me was it wasn't, if I sat there and thought about it long enough that I could retrieve the memory was never made. So that's scary. It's like someone, I think it's another Stephen King thing where he talks about it's as if the film gets spliced and it's just gone. It's just gone. It's a scary thing.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I had no idea. That's so interesting.
What's also interesting about what you said about taking risks and making mistakes and stuff like that is so much of what I was so risk oriented in my brain that Dan Siegel said this other really interesting thing when I talked with him on the phone, that I was scared to death about the fact that we moved right during it was after 8th grade, before going into a new high school. He'd had lifelong friends since elementary school. He went to a small K-8 school, and I trusted the parents. I knew the parents really well, and we were sort of really parenting as a village. And we moved to this place where he knew no one. I knew no parents of kids here, and I essentially created a big risk factor. I mean, it was the best thing for our family, but for him, it was not good. And yet Dan Siegel, of course, turned it around and said, well, but adolescents are wired for novelty and risk. And there is so much novelty and risk in moving. So this is about framing. How do you frame, just for yourself and for him, that making new friends, trying out for something new, going and checking out a club, meeting new people, all of that is positive risk. And one of the ways we help kids satisfy that need for positive risk for risk in general, is by introducing some positive risk. And just for the parents listening, when you're a kid, you have to understand that adolescents have baseline lower levels of dopamine than adults and younger children. So when you're teenagers, like, I'm just so bored, it's not that they're lacking imagination. They really are bored, because dopamine is motivation. Dopamine is like engaging with life and drive and all that sort of stuff. And so if their baseline levels are lower than, at any other time during life, of course, they're going to seek out adrenaline and risk and things that sort of give them a little squirt of dopamine so that they can feel something. So just keeping all of that in the background, I think, can be helpful for helping kids find ways to take risks that are productive and helpful for them. They're usually sometimes not quite as fun as like jumping off of a garage into a pool or something like that. But we can help guide them in ways.
Yeah, not as good on TikTok, but I get that. Yeah.
Yeah.
it's such a great, interesting point, such a good one, because we're back to these chemicals of, dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin. I mean, these are are neurotransmitters that meet specific needs. And to that story about the woman who said drugs got me through, that if we don't have healthy ways to meet those needs, we're going to use unhealthy ways to meet those needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of her other outlets was self-harm, and I don't recommend that either. But, when we don't give people outlets for their pain, then they're either going to try to numb or try to release it in some other way. And, either we're there with interventions and therapy and name it to tame it and integration and all the other, things that we can try, or, self-medicating happens. And, there's also all kinds of schools of thought in addiction science and in substance abuse, all the different camps. There's the it's a brain disease camp, which has valid points. And it's the developmental disorder camp, which definitely has valid points. And there's it's trauma related, and Gabor Mate's out there writing about that in a very convincing way. Or here's a crazy thought. It could be a little bit of all these things. We don't have to put all of our chips
it's a harder book to write.
I know. But I don't know. I think people's lack of imagination around multifaceted, people want to say, 12-step recovery is the only way to get better. I don't believe that either. It worked for me. Definitely didn't work for other people I know. I think, and this in education, we're all about that. It's all black and white. You're either, you're this or they're that. And if you're for this, you can't be for that. And that just drives me nuts. And so that's why I think a lot of for example, the peers chapter that features a kid named Brian, the sort of the theory is that peer group is a huge risk. If friends of your kids use drugs and alcohol, then that is a huge risk factor for substance abuse. And but I think it's a little more complicated than that. And that's what's interesting to me is, what does the research say, but what does the research not say about the confounders in there, and why this may be a correlation thing and not a causation thing. And so I like looking in the gray areas. I'm a fan of the gray areas.
Yeah, well, they're certainly more interesting, and I think the truth lies in there. They're messier, right? They're harder.
Yeah. And it's also frustrating for me as someone who purports to be helpful to parents, because some of this, I want to be able to fix things. I want to be able to wave a magic wand. Okay, your kid doesn't like math. I can now wave my magic wand because I read a lot of research, and I can make your kid interested in math, and that's just not how it works. Or wave this magic wand over here, and your kid guaranteed will never have a problem with substances. And I can't do that either. All I can do is say, here's all the risks. Here's all the protections. The more protections you have, the more it can mitigate the risks. And, let me just give you all the information so that you can figure out what'll work best for your family and your kid.
Yeah, I love that.
I'd rather just have the magic wand, though.
Yeah.
That's what's missing from my wall. I'm going to go, I have to put up, my kids have their Harry Potter wands that they've outgrown, and I should put those on. I have a feather, but I should put some Harry Potter wands up.
Nothing like a little omnipotence to get you through the day.
Exactly.
I do so love that justice scale of perceiving more risks. How do we protect kids more? To your point about that messiness, it makes me think a little bit about parenting styles, right? That high love and high discipline are kind of where we want to be, but it's so much easier to kind of go all in on what was it Jane Nelson talks about being kind or being firm, but also kind, and it's easier to be one or the other.
Right.
Can you kind of walk parents through a little bit what we know about parenting styles and kind of in a perfect world, the direction we move in?
Yeah. So it turns out that, most of the time when I talk about gift of failure, people automatically think, oh, Lahey's talking about permissive parenting, that you just kind of walk away, put your hands up and say, go for it, kid, you're on your own. And that's absolutely not what I'm saying at all. In fact, I think I've been a much more strict parent since handing some autonomy over to my kids. So the idea is that if you are the kind of parent who just says, these are the rules, do it because I said so, controlling a lot of what your kid does, being highly directive, that sort of parenting actually will foster dishonesty in the relationship. We know that kids who are more highly controlled lie to their parents more. But if you're the kind of parent that has high expectations, but is supportive of the kids when they fall short of those expectations and helps them become better, I'm all about progress over end product. I'm all about, getting kids to believe me when I say what I really care about is the learning, because, what are you going to do to make it better next time? That kind of parenting is the kind of parenting that really hits the sweet spot of, supportive and I love you, I love you, I love you, you're so wonderful, but not that and then the world will come, the world will rain down around you if, you break one rule. That's sort of, I think that's a really hard spot to hang on to, mainly because we tend to parent from emergencies. We tend to parent from what's going wrong today and what I need to get done today and what needs to be perfect today. And I tend to, there have been times when I've said to my parents, they should just respect us more. This is infuriating. This is disrespectful, and they should just respect us more. And I think my husband was raised by two parents he was an only child, and he was raised by two parents who really felt that respect was something to be earned and talked with their kid like he was a smart, intelligent, human being to be respected. And he was like, yeah, but in this situation, we have to look at how we're handling this, that, and the other thing. Whereas I tend to think, I was used to think more no, they just have to obey because we're the parents and we're saying this, and that's going to get you into trouble, I think. And like I said, for lots of things, not only because it can undermine your relationship, but also, as we've talked about before, kids are adolescents in particular are individuating, and they need more autonomy with each passing year, more control over details of their life with each passing year. And if we don't give it to them, they're going to find it and they're going to grab it. And sometimes they'll grab it by deceit. And during this pandemic, that's been a disaster, right? Because we as parents, if we feel helpless as parents, as adults, think how helpless they feel. And then the problem is that we feel helpless. So we're taking more control in the only place we have control, which is in our homes with our families. Now, all of a sudden, kids have even less autonomy and control than they had before. And taking away autonomy and control creates learned helplessness and creates low levels of self-efficacy. And we end up in a horrible cycle where we're creating helpless kids. And
Can I repeat
kids
that?
Who will lie to us.
If I can repeat that back for one moment, because I think it's such an important point that we know how stressful is a low sense of control.
Yeah.
And that stress for so many kids is one of the reasons that they take up substances or use them more frequently to sort of self-soothe or self-medicate. But it's hard for us as parents to give up. It's a little bit of a zero-sum game, right? For my kid to have more autonomy, more control, I have to let go. And that, of course, is a little bit stressful for me, right? And so I think about, the Eli Leibovitz in space and, stuff about parents meditating. If parents are more calm, their kids can be, they can support that autonomy and take stress out of the kind of family dynamic, regardless of what their kids do.
Well, and think about self-efficacy. If a kid, and I had kids like this in my rehab classroom all the time, where no matter what decisions they made at home, it wasn't going to change anything. They were still going to get beat at the end of the day. They were still going to have to take care of their little sister because their parents were drunk. So since they know that no action they take will change anything, they could report their parents to Child Protective Services and nothing's going to happen. Or mom had a restraining order against dad and that didn't do anything. She still got hit. So those kids say, well, it doesn't matter what I do, so why bother? And instead, I'll just self-soothe, I'll self-medicate, I'll numb out. But giving kids a sense of efficacy is one of the most important things we do towards, giving them that empowerment to feel like, okay, well, this makes me feel uncomfortable, but I can change it. And that's the other problem, and why we tend to see drug and alcohol use, in people who don't have a lot of power in their world, because they are disenfranchised, because they're marginalized, because they're, seen as less than. You would assume that it would be really difficult to feel that sense of empowerment if everyone
Yeah.
around you is telling you you have no power and you have no agency. So giving kids as much as possible, I think, is one of the more important things we can do for kids. For again, I say for around gift of failure, I say one of the most important things we do is give kids the ability to self-advocate and give them feelings of not just self-esteem, but self-efficacy. That's not just a substance abuse prevention thing. That's a rah, kids are amazing and they need to grow into being
Yeah.
productive adults. And if we're looking at, what ideally we want to raise kids who can go out there and be innovative and change the world and think outside the box and think of things that haven't been invented yet and go and invent them. Those are kids who feel self-efficacy, because why would you go out and try to invent something if you didn't think that you would have any impact on the world, no matter what you did?
That's a good point.
Which is so important, which is why, coming back to education, which is why relevance in the classroom is so important. Because if I'm a teacher, sure, I can have a great relationship with a kid and I can get them engaged sometimes if I tap into some emotional resources, because we know that learning is emotional. But think about how much more power I have as a teacher to help them learn if what I'm teaching, let's say what I'm teaching is geometry, and I help them understand how an understanding of geometry can help them go out into the world and build bridges that won't fall down during an earthquake. I mean, that's taking what we're learning, the abstract stuff that we're learning in the classroom, and giving it an application, and not just an application to other people out there, but an application to that kid and to that kid's sense of power and possibility and hope within the world. That's why it's so hard to teach kids the quadratic formula, because it's hard to give them an example of when in the course of everyday life they will use that thing. You don't tend to run up against that. But certainly with fractions, there are ways with kids to, we've talked about this before, whether it's making pancakes in the morning or helping them understand seam allowances. There are very practical ways to do that, which is why some of what you do is so hard, because so much of the stuff that, for example, is on the SAT doesn't get in there because it's like, well, when am I going to ever use this? Am I learning this just for a test, or am I learning this for anything practical? So the more we can hook into that relevance and practicality and ability personally to use that information, not just to make my life better, but to make the world better, that's when we have kids who really feel a sense of self-efficacy and competence in the world. And that's protective.
College Board might protest otherwise, I'm sure. But adding to that, you make an excellent point, and I can't get the words right, but something to the fact that the more relevant kids feel in school, the more it predicts basically every outcome for them as adults. That, how connected kids feel in school is this, you can predict, how they're going to do with kind of everything, much like with the A scores.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to that saying of kindergarten teachers saying that the most important skills that kids learn are executive function skills and social emotional learning skills, because that has to do with our connection to other human beings. But yes, relevance, that secret sauce of teaching, is all about connecting the kid to the material and the material to the world in some way, or at least something the kid is interested in. So, which brings us back around to, we've talked a lot about this in terms of gift of failure and pandemic parenting and what makes it so hard. One of the opportunities has been, well, if your kid is home more and you know what your kid cares about, and we have this thing called, YouTube, you can go and find, videos that make, the study of geometry or chemistry, whatever, relevant, whether it's in terms of a big, exploding pile of foam in someone's backyard, or whether it's in terms of, oh, that's interesting. On Mythbusters, they showed that, I can't remember who it was. It was like in Sparta, they had the big, I'm going to get this wrong, but they were trying to show that there was some myth about the idea that the Greeks or someone used mirrors to blind the sailors on ships. And they had these big reflecting, I can't believe I'm now citing something I don't know the words to. I've gotten pretty good at not doing that. But they had to use geometry, and they had to use, I talk about Michael Stevens all the time. He has these great videos. He has a channel called Vsauce and another series called Mind Field on YouTube, Red, where he'll do something like, what would happen? What would it be like if the moon was a disco ball. And he has to, and so, it's a really cool question, but it requires a lot of application of stuff that you wouldn't normally have an application for, or what would happen if everyone on the earth jumped at the same time. And the reason I love those questions is suddenly you're talking about plate tectonics and population density and gravity and all these other things. But he is such a gifted educator. Again, his name is Michael Stevens, or Vsauce, because he makes this stuff that can feel awfully abstract. He makes it relevant for kids. And that's why my kid many times over has said, oh my gosh, I've learned more from Michael Stevens than I ever did, from a whole year of science class. Because that's why Mythbusters, I think, was so popular. That, and kids learned so much from it. That and the explosions.
This one's new to me. I know how I'm going to spend the rest of my afternoon. So this will be fun.
Vsauce is great. There's actually Vsauce 1, Vsauce 2, and Vsauce 3. Vsauce, the main channel, is Michael Stevens. And then his Mind Feels show is about psychology. So he does experiments and in his first season, he did isolation. He was in an isolation room for 3 days. He's done all sorts of, he looks at sort of the classic psychology experiments and looks at things like empathy, and it's really interesting. He's really cool. He did a tour with Adam Savage called Brain Scoop, Brain something. Anyway, Brain Candy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a great mix of Adam Savage from Mythbusters and Michael Stevens from Vsauce, just doing science experiments on the stage. It was really cool. Hopefully that'll come back someday.
Yeah. Yes. You have you have a wonderful line. I'm gonna ramp things up so I don't keep you all day, because I know you have so much to talk about.
Off the rails.
It's so much fun. Well, so if I may, this is page 194 in your wonderful book. So you write, the secret sauce of parenting and educating for substance abuse prevention is to help our kids maintain positive, healthy relationships, harness the positive social pressure in their peer groups, and equip all kids with the skills they need to stay safe and healthy, no matter who they hang out with. And here are the practical ways to do just that. It's so, I mean, that's kind of like it in a book, right? And then the how-to of it, which I love so much.
I have to credit, just from the perspective of my talking a lot about my students with about things that I've done wrong. So I had to learn, my editor taught me how to write like that. It's not my natural thing to be that organized. It was my editor that taught me how to write like that. So I owe her so much. Yeah, that was something that evolved through learning how to write a book. It wasn't like something I could just do naturally. So when I talk to my students about writing and they're like, well, I know how to write an essay. I'm done now, right? And I say, well, not really. That's not how writing goes.
Hashtag am writing.
Yeah.
If I just will take a couple minutes and talk about that, that it's the importance of healthy relationships, and of course, starting with parents, who are who are going to be the people reading this book. I would love for you just to run through a few of the ideas that you have about how we as parents can really foster that connection. Maybe you talk about the Scoville sauce, because that's hilarious. But you tell a story in the book about one of your students, and when he graduated, this boy Jeremy, and he sort of had this connection with you and his classmates, and then his parents talked. Can you tell that story and about his dad, because that was something.
Yeah, it was, graduation from rehab is scary because your kid's been in a safe place and now they've got to go back. And if you think about adolescent substance abuse in particular, adults, it can be much easier for adults to get sober and stay sober than for kids. Relapse is very much a part of kids' story. We would get the same kids coming back over and over and over again, simply because if you think about it, they don't have a lot of control in their lives. And we, treat them and then send them back into the same peer groups and the same school with the same problems and the same teachers, and
back into the war zone,
back into their homes where they were either, where there was abuse or they were taking care of a sibling or whatever that thing was. So, parents at graduations, it's with great hope that we welcome our child back into our lives. And, the parents love to talk about, they see such great promise, and they always see such great promise in their children, because when our kids are little, we dream about all of the things that our kids may become. And it can make us so angry at them, at the world when they get derailed, when drugs and alcohol come into the picture and sort of take that kid away. But when it comes down to it, what our kids really need to know is that we love them, that as for this kid in particular, that they picked him. I mean, he had been adopted, and adoption is a topic in the substance abuse world. Those feelings of, whether it's those feelings of abandonment or whatever, can really mess you up a little bit. And Candy Finnegan talks about that beautifully quite a bit. She's an expert in substance abuse, and they really got at what was most important about him is the fact that he was theirs and that they loved him and they chose him and that they're going to be there for him. They've gotten angry at him over the years because of some of the things he's done, but that has never changed the way that they feel about him. And, I think having that place to come back to, that's the reason why, family dinners are so important. And it's not even about family dinner. Family dinner is emblematic of a thing, which is really about a regular return to connection with our as a family, with our kids, looking in each other's eyes. It's harder to hide things when we have to look in each other's eyes and talk to each other. I will say, however, there's some conversations like substance abuse conversations that work really well in places like when you're next to each other and not looking at each other, like in the car or on a ski lift. As we have, a ski lift was where many of our kids' sex conversations happened. My husband had a lot of those conversations on the ski lift.
Because it's less intense, because there's less.
Because you don't have to look each other in the eye. You can sort of stare off into the middle distance and pretend for a moment you're not quite there. But the thing that you were talking about in terms of the family dinner thing is, as your kids get older and they're with adolescence and they don't really want to hang with you as much, it's just devastating for me. But my kids don't want to hang out with me. So there's a certain amount of inventiveness that you have to go to sort of get your kids to want to hang. And for me, there's a story in the book about the fact that one of our favorite shows as a family is called Hot Ones. And it's on a YouTube channel called First We Feast. And Sean Evans is a talented interviewer. And one of the reasons he's so good, not just because he's a great researcher, one of the reasons he's so good is that the person he's interviewing, he and the person he's interviewing eat 10 wings in ascending level of spiciness. The Scoville scale you talked about is the measure of spiciness. And we love that show. We watch it all the time. And so I went to my husband and I said, I have an idea. I'm going to recreate that. And we're going to have a dinner, a totally unhealthy dinner that's either wings or vegan wings, depending on the person in our family. And we'll come up with 10 questions, one for each kid. Some of the questions were the same, some were different depending on the kid. And with each wing, the kids have to answer a question. And it was so much fun, not just because it worked and the kids talked to us, but because they totally got how hard I was working to come to them from a place of their level. It was sort of fun at its essence. And with each question, we also talked about each other's answers. Like, oh, that's interesting. Like one of the questions was, which of your parents do you think you resemble more in terms of personality traits? And, if Ben answered it one way and Finn was like, oh man, I didn't think you'd say that. I thought it would be this other thing. We just found out a ton about each other, not only from the kids' answers, but from our responses to those answers. And it was fun. We were laughing. We ended up drinking ice cream at the end because by the time you get up to the last sauce, it's called the last dab, and it's like 1 million Scoville units. It's inedible. But we all did it, and it was super fun. It was really, really fun.
I read this and I was so inspired, except whatever gene or whatever it is that allows people to process hot things, I apparently have zero. And my wife, somewhat jokingly, putting me in my place, will observe to anyone. Yeah, Ned, he starts to sweat with ketchup. I'm like, would you just stop?
Well,
so
and
I don't know how.
The important thing about those questions also is like, we didn't want to embarrass our kids. Like I wasn't going to ask them, stuff that I shouldn't have been poking around in. These were questions that just allowed me to get to know our kids better. But one thing that might work for you that worked for us, New Year's Eve, we were all pretty bummed about the fact that we couldn't be with friends and stuff like that. We have a tradition we do with couple of friends. And so I went to a craft store that was having a sale and bought a bunch of canvases and paint and paintbrushes, just, cheap stuff, and told everyone to meet at the dining room table at 6 o'clock with 2 photographs that they had picked that they liked from their phone. And then we painted. And they are horrifyingly bad. Finn, turns out, is quite talented. Ben chose the hardest thing ever. He chose a picture of him with all of his friends, and that's really hard to paint. I chose our house and my husband, a barn, and my husband chose our house. And they're horrible, but they're now hanging over our fireplace because they're ugly, but they represent a really cool evening where we all painted. We were there for hours just painting. It was so much fun.
That's so funny. I love that. Yeah, the secret sauce and that connection. Well, to end with you talking about those family dinners, about having folks share the high, the low, and the funny.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think your book does such a wonderful job of getting all 3 of those. And it just seems to me that for all the stories of people where things went well and when things didn't go well, that connection, really how they got through difficult situations seemed to be almost in direct correlation to how connected they felt to people around them.
In that peers chapter in particular, when we were talking a lot with my son Ben about his relationship with Brian. And by the way, huge shout out to both Brian and Georgia. Those are their real names. They very specifically wanted their names used. Brian is now working, wants to work with kids, and wants to make his own rehab. Georgia is getting a master's degree now, but these are kids who stood to lose like everything. Georgia nearly died. Wow. But Ben, Ben's relationship with Brian was so scary for me because I knew Brian got kicked out of school more than once for his drug use. And I know that, the research says that peer cohort is a huge predictor. But Ben's having these conversations was so important because if I had just said, you can't be friends with Brian anymore, it's too dangerous, that would have gone bad so quickly. But instead we talked about it. And what came out of that was Ben's understanding that Ben and a couple of his friends were the stability that Brian needed. And they believed in Brian. And it was important to them that he knew that they were going to be there for him because they might just be the thing that makes him think twice before relapsing. And in the end, that ended up being 100% true. And I think Brian talks about that so eloquently, especially when he talks about the very last run they went on the day that his last day at school. He got kicked out permanently at one point, and they had one last day together. And that really for Brian was the turning point because he realized, I'm losing all of this. And if I had just read the research from a place of black and white, my temptation would have been, you can't be friends with this kid. I'm going to make sure that you're not friends with this kid. I'm going to make sure you're not in the same dorm with this kid, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's not about communication, and that's not about trust. That's about, that sort of what we were talking about before, the parenting style that's just about, you're going to do it this way because I said so, because I know best, because I'm the adult. Because in that sense, I didn't know best. And I learned a lot about my son and his ability for his compassion and his empathy and his loyalty as a friend. Those are really important parts of him that I didn't have a full vision of before. We talked a lot about that. We talked about it regularly. I checked in with him probably more than he was comfortable with, but he also understood, why. I explained that I was checking in with him on that regularly because there is a lot of risk to him by being around someone who's involved in drugs and alcohol as much as Brian was.
I just love that sense of the respect that you conveyed to him and the trust, because I can well imagine it would be so easy to not do those, and to drag Ben away from Brian out of fear that Ben would get dragged down. When in fact it sounds like Ben put on his cape and saved his friend.
I think it helped that Ben was anchored on the other side by a group of friends, and he was involved in a sport that sports is a mixed bag. I mean, the more it turns out that the more contact sporty it is, the more contact there is, the higher the rates of substance abuse. Ben was a cross country runner. Levels are really low there. And he was very active in his team, and the teammates were the people I'm talking about. So he did have that anchor. If he hadn't had that anchor and he was really adrift, if he didn't have a lot of friends and Brian was his only friend, that would have been a very different level of worry for me, which is why, again, we can't think about these things in black and white. And the more I know about Ben, the more I can gauge how concerned I'm supposed to be about this particular situation.
I did a podcast with a guy who was a physical trainer and a hardcore runner, and was explaining to me that we talk about running releasing endorphins. He said, but it also releases endocannabinoids.
Yeah. Yep.
It's the same compound.
Yeah.
But apparently only if you run a certain number of miles. So you don't get that in the 100-yard dash. You get that in cross country. So maybe they're onto something.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, sports can have a positive risk effect and a negative risk effect. And I go into that in the book as well.
Yeah. Well, with two quick things. If you were to go back and think about yourself as a person, young person, and your parents, if you were to give one piece of advice to your mom and dad and one piece of advice to your, I don't know, teenage or 20-year-old self, what might it be?
For me, it really, my role in the family was as the peacekeeper and the appeaser and the perfect one that could fix everything. And I think that's always been difficult for me to remember that I can't fix everyone. And when my parent went into recovery, I had to realize that I couldn't be in charge of that person's recovery, that whether or not my parents stayed sober was not under my control. And no matter what I did, I couldn't make that happen. And that was, that's a little serenity prayer kind of thing. Know what you control and what you can't kind of thing. But that was really important to me. And I think I wish I had learned that earlier, that, I can't control other people's actions, but I can control my reaction to those actions. And that's been one of the most important things I've learned. And that's definitely the advice I would give.
Well, I am one, grateful for your time, and two, so grateful for your honesty, your openness, your vulnerability, the incredible research that you put into this book. It is, I wish I'd had this earlier, but I have it now, as does the rest of the world.
That's the problem with my writing books that I need and can't find, is I have to get to the point where I need the book and then I have to go write it. I mean, that was the story with Gift of Failure. It's the story with this book. So yeah, I wish I'd had this a lot earlier. And actually, I have to say, it's been tough for my younger kid, because Finn says, this is so unfair. Like when Ben was my age, you believed that whole moderation myth, and you believed in the whole, like, if we just raise kids like Europeans and let them have sips, they'll learn moderation. And now that you know that that's all a big myth and it's not true, it's like now there's a total abstinence until 21 approach, and that's not fair. Ben got that. So, but on the other hand, I'm modeling for him what I most want to see in him, which is, I wasn't doing that right, and I've learned something, and I'm going to change and try to be better and do better next time. And sorry, he happens to be the hopefully.
I just picture you whispering to him, I love your brain more than your brother's brain. That's bad parenting. People don't do that. We don't do that.
That's a good reason.
We don't do that.
Yeah. But, modeling what I want to see from him and myself. And I just got to stick with that and hope I'm doing the right thing.
Well, you really do walk the walk. So
I hope so.
Walk the talk, whatever. You're getting it right.
Talk the talk and walk the walk, I hope.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's good stuff. Jessica Lahey. The book is The Addiction Inoculation. Out April 6th? I don't know when this podcast is dropping.
April 6th. There's another, and just for your listeners, there's another killer book coming out that day by Julie Lythcott-Haims called Your Turn, How to Be an Adult. And it's going to be, for those of you out there who have kids who are going to be leaving the nest soon, this could be a fantastic graduation gift for them. So April 6th is a big deal because Julie and I both have books coming out that day. So little props for
buy
Julie's
them both.
book.
Amazon. You can save the economy save the environment as well by having them delivered in the same box from Amazon, or your local bookstore.
Right. Actually, can I say that if you go to my website, jessicalahey.com, there is a link directly to my local bookstore where I will be traveling to sign personally, do those like personalized signatures on the title page, and they ship for free. So if you go to my website, jessicalahey.com, click on the link that goes to the Phoenix Books in Burlington, Vermont, and I can sign it for you there. I can put whatever you want in there, with some limitations, I assume. And they'll ship it for free, and you can have a signed copy shipped for free.
Perfect. We're on it. We're on it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's an incredible book. It really is.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Prep Talks. Please subscribe to us for free at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.